welcome and thanks for tuning in to the Victorian Aboriginal News Van Talks podcast. I'm your host, Charles Parkiner.
Victorian Aboriginal News acknowledges and pays respect to traditional owners and custodians across Australia. We acknowledge the elders who have gone before, those who currently lead their communities, and those who will follow in years and generations to come.
Today on Van Talks, we're sitting under a beautiful tree out at Coranderrk, an historical place here near Healesville. And I'm sitting here with Uncle Dave Wandin from the Wurundjeri woi-wurrung. Now, before we start this interview, I just want to explain to the audience that this particular interview was intended to be something about Uncle Dave's work out here. The reality is that in the lead up to this interview, Uncle Dave and I had a pre-interview yarn. We chatted about the history of Coranderrk, and the decision was made almost immediately, okay, we need to provide the history of Coranderrk. And that's as Uncle Dave recalls it, lives it, and tells it. Uncle Dave, welcome to the Van Talks podcast.
Thank you, Charles. Sorry, is it Uncle Charles or Charles?
Oh, you can call me Charles on this one, Uncle. So, tell us a little bit about the starting point of Coranderrk. Now, I'm asking you to encapsulate essentially an hour of conversation that we had previously, but let's start the ball rolling. Yeah. When did it all start?
1863. It needs to be embedded in people's minds, 1863. It is a cornerstone of what we do here at Coranderrk today. You have to have a beginning.
Sure.
Even though the history of Coranderrk goes further back than 1863. This is a place of our ancestors for, of course, many tens of thousands of years.
And you were saying that it was a summer camp area.
That's right, yeah.
So what typically would have happened here, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, the summertime, the floods would have receded from the winter.
Yeah.
You'd be camping here in the summer, collecting the grasses for the seeds.
Yeah.
The kangaroos would have been, because the grasses from the spring would be up, so plenty of kangaroos. They're still here today, kangaroos and wallabies. I'm assuming there would have been emus, the possums, birds' eggs, all those kind of things, which there's not so many of them here now.
But plenty of food.
Absolutely plenty of food. We're sitting on a floodplain here of the Yarra River, or the Birrarung as everyone is now calling it. So, yeah, the food would have been in plenty. But it also would have been in preparation for autumn, coming up soon actually, for the migration of the eels down the Yarra River.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So there will be big gatherings, not just of Wurundjeri people, northern tribes of Victoria. So the northern rivers don't have eels.
So you would have had the Tungarung coming?
Yeah, the Tungarung, the Jar-Jar-Jarong, even the Yorta-Yorta on occasion.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all coming down over crossing the Great Dividing Range to enjoy our eel harvest. So, yeah, prepping the campsite, collecting food, for those times where we might have hundreds and hundreds of people. There's a story about the Bolan Billabong, which is the last recorded Tanderrum, and they did record around 500 people that stayed there for 6 weeks. And when you try and comprehend that now, about how do you prepare for that kind of thing, it's like preparing for a concert today. When you're going to have 10,000 people, how are you going to get all the food there and the toilet facilities? You've got to have a storage of all these things that are available. For sure. And that's what we would have been doing over the summertime, preparing for this annual eel migration, which would also mean the migration of a lot of people coming from northern Victoria down to southern Victoria to share in our bounty.
So to the best of your knowledge, when would that have actually stopped?
Geez, on a date, I don't have an answer, but as I said, the last recorded big gathering of Aborigines was at Bolan Billabong in Pauline, and I believe that was around about the time of the gold rush.
Right.
Which was pretty much when life for Aboriginal people stopped. We were just in the way all the time.
So let's get back to 1863 and to this place, Coranderrk, being used as a mission. Let's get back onto the story there.
Yeah, so 1863, as an important date to us, was the first declaration of the rights of Aboriginal people. In other words, this mission station was not chosen by the government, as many of the others were, that was set aside for Aboriginal people. This was chosen by our people.
This was Uncle William and Uncle Simon at the time.
Yep.
So how did that
Wonga and Barrack.
Wonga and Barrack.
We should use their
proper names?
William and Simon, I guess, were their Christian given names.
Oh, yep.
Wonga and Barrack. Yeah.
So how did that come about?
Well, It comes about from the gold rush era or the beginning of Melbourne in 1835, 86.
You're taking us back to Toorak here?
Yeah, we can begin there.
Let's go back to Toorak.
And I've never confirmed it, but basically...
It's a good story.
My dad told me this story, and he told a lot of stories which I used to think were jokes, but I found out that some of them are true. But the one story he told me was the first mission station for Wurundjeri people was actually set up in Toorak. Which at that time was far enough out of the beginnings of Melbourne that the Aboriginal people were out of the way.
So get that problem out of the way, out to Toorak.
Yeah. But very quickly Melbourne started expanding, especially with the discovery of gold. And so they pushed us out from there, and we either went to Pound Bend at Warrandyte or what is known today as the Dandenong police paddocks.
But you ended up also at Tangerang. On Tangerang country.
Well, eventually, even those places were in the way of the settlers, if you like. So Pound Bend, they discovered gold there.
Yep.
And, very quickly, no, the blackfellas are in the way. So, that's where I think we then moved to Dandenong police paddocks.
Right.
But then farmers and that started coming in. It wasn't just the gold. And, we were moved from there. There may have been another one in between, but eventually we moved up to either the Acheron or the Rubicon River on Tangerang country, where lots of Aboriginal people were pushed from across Victoria. We need to get them well out of the way.
So when you're saying from across Victoria...
Yeah, even though they were setting up other mission stations as well.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of us were running around. We were pretty much homeless. We didn't know where we could go. We'd been in trouble with the settlers. The settlers were, chasing us down and hunting us. So there was quite a variety of mobs across Victoria that ended up on Tangerang country.
So was this a forced relocation on the Tangerang country?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
So one of the problems that I've heard over the years is that when the settlers did this, or the colonists did this, they gave no thought to the fact that there were existing animosities that may have existed between mobs. I mean, even though the five mobs of the Kulin nations, there were wars that existed and animosities that existed.
There was always disputes.
Yeah.
As there is between any neighbours.
Sure.
And they find it strange that because we were all black, so therefore we're all of one race and all of one thing. And yet you look at the wars that are still happening in the world today, of dark skin, white skin, yellow skin, red skin, whatever.
Yeah.
It's taken years for people to realise that we are all different. We all have various responsibilities for the area of land which was given to us, either handed down from our ancestors or from our creators.
Yeah.
The whole colonisation thing about this is our God-given right to take this land, which is how they took over Australia.
Terra nullius.
Yeah, all of those kind of things. It's ridiculous. Luckily, the world is waking up to that. But, there's still disputes about who belongs to what country and where. But what was established up on Tangerang land was the land that they were given could not sustain the amount of people that were there. And they were actually starving. And that's because by the time we were pushed out of Melbourne, whether it was from Pound Bend or police paddocks, another settler had already been given a claim, and he got there before us. And
this is up Tangerang country.
Up on Tangerang country, And he sort of looked at his land and said, I can't survive on this. What's that land over there? And he basically shifted the claims. And so by the time we got there, there was land, my ancestors got there. There was no way that they could actually exist within that country without supplies being brought up from Melbourne. Without supplies and being totally reliant on the government of the day to support that mission station, it just wasn't possible. There was no game. The land was very barren. So even though there was water there wasn't much else in the way of what would normally sustain our culture, it's with supplementary fishing and hunting and harvesting of those kind of things.
Now, when would this have been roughly?
So now we're in between 1855, 1860, 61.
Okay, so we're leading up to the time
to
down
1863,
here. Now, Wonga and Barak were up there.
That's right, yeah. Along with John Green, the appointed white superintendent. But they were very good friends, the three of them. And although there were others involved as well, I don't have a lot of knowledge about that. Even John Green knew that it was not sustainable.
But John Green, let's just talk about John Green just for a minute, to the best of your knowledge. Now, he was essentially the caretaker, the manager.
Yep.
So what was his mission in life?
That's a good question. So he was appointed by the Aboriginal Protection Board to take this group of people and be in charge of them.
It always rings warning bells when you hear the Aboriginal Protection Board.
He was a Scottish Presbyterian minister, but he had a different view of the Australian government of the day.
And a different view
he actually
towards
wanted
Aboriginal
to
people,
work
though.
with Aboriginal people. He wanted to understand them.
Yep.
So he was much more lenient than many of the other superintendents at the other mission stations, which were also set up around Victoria.
The superintendents at that time, they were also tasked with eliminating culture, with Christianising those black heathens, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. We're basically to introduce Christianity and to assimilate Aboriginal people into the new modern culture.
Sure.
Yeah. And to do that, like any other invader or conqueror, is you remove their religion, which again, we're still not recognised as having a religion. They call it a culture. And yet our culture is based on making sure we pay our respects to our Creator, just like a church pays respect to God.
Yeah.
But they couldn't understand that. They didn't understand the ways of the land, that it was not there for our taking. We were there as custodians, and we still are here as custodians. We couldn't sell it. We couldn't exchange it. We could exchange goods that were harvested from it, and we did that, with many other tribes. And the whole reason our Aboriginal culture still survives today, because that kind of reciprocal exchange still happens.
Sure.
And it's respectful, and there are rules and laws around that. Much more complicated than what we call government today. We talk about all the laws and road rules and stamp duties and taxes and all those kind of things. So everybody whinges about cost of living. We had a system that worked for tens of thousands of years, whereas it might not have been 100% harmonious, but it was truly respectful of whose land you were on and what your responsibilities were while you were there.
But John Green, he seems to have understood a lot of this.
Yeah, how much he understood, I don't know. There are a lot of journals, and we're still going through them. And you've got to read them and reread them and reread them and reread them, just like a lawyer has to read any legislation.
Yeah.
But from what we know, what has been gathered, he was much more lenient in how long it took for people to assimilate into the new way of life. He understood that there was some power. There was a governance system, a hierarchy, that if you didn't understand that, you would never get the Aboriginal people on side.
Right.
So he worked with Wonga and Barak. So instead of him telling them what they should do, like as the whole mob of going out there lining them up and saying, you go here and you go there, he basically set these Aboriginal overseers, if you like, that's a better word I can say for the day, you say, look, we need to get this done, and we need to get that done. And then Barak, Wonga and others would then delegate those tasks. So the Aboriginal people felt like they still had some control over their lives, instead of just waking up in the morning, I wonder where I'm going to be working today, kind of thing.
So that was seen up north in Coranderrk country, that relationship was existing up there.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, so...
Yep.
We're looking around about 1861, when obviously the mob at that point in time are recognising that it's not sustainable up there. There's no food, there's water, but obviously not appropriate shelter. So a lot of sufferings.
Yes.
The move then back down here.
They were starting to starve.
Right.
The young ones were getting, the old ones and the young ones were getting sick because there wasn't the nutrition that we were used to.
Sure.
Even though there might have been plenty of flour and tobacco. Well, if it was never enough.
Yeah.
Pretty much it was like a prison camp. I often talk about the mission stations as being Australia's version of the German concentration camps.
Well, the British were very good at doing that. They did it in South Africa.
Yeah.
They did
and
it
you look through the history and you see it's happened everywhere.
For sure.
Which is why the British got kicked out of all those places, eventually. And this was their last stand, really, their last invaded country.
Back to about 1861.
Yeah.
The move back down here to Coranderrk, to here to Coranderrk.
Yeah, basically the mob got upset. John Green wasn't getting any answers from the government about regular supplies and all those kind of things, so they walked off. They said, we've had enough. We're all going to walk back to Melbourne and we're going to protest.
And this was led by Wonga and Barrack?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Now, Barrack at the time was the Narangita?
That's a good question. I think Simon Wonga was the Narangita.
Right.
I don't think Barrack was declared Narangita until we set up here at Coranderrk.
So around about 1861, they walked off?
Yep.
Came down to Melbourne?
Well, they were heading to Melbourne. But because of all the malnutrition and the undernourishment of most of the mob, they were absolutely exhausted.
Now, this is when you're talking about Black Spur, that geographic point.
Yep.
Tell us a bit about that, Unc.
Yeah, so the reality is to get to somewhere where they could rest and recuperate, and it was coming over the top of the mountains here, what we know as the Yarra Ranges, they needed to be spurred on. And that was, for some of them, with whips, and some of them were carried and stretchered, and it was really, really a hard slog.
Wow.
And Barrack and Wonga and Green and others, realised that not all of them were going to be able to make it to Melbourne. But they knew of this place here on the Yarra, and they knew that there was plenty of food, or it should have been, depending on how settled it was. But luckily, no one had settled in this area. And so they looked at this place and said, this is where we would summer camp and we could support a few hundred people. So they said, right, we're going to set up camp here. All of you guys can rest, and the ones who are healthy enough will do the rest of the walk.
So this was intended to be a temporary thing, just to rest the mob?
Yep.
Several hundred mob?
No, they made a decision that looking at this land compared to where they come from, with the amount of people here, this could sustain them.
Yep.
This was sustainable. It had the floodplains, it had the mountains just behind you, nice rolling hills, lots of grasslands, lots of forest land. So therefore, the whole variety of, in those days still, the medicines, the foods, both animal, birds, and eggs, the waterways with plenty of fish in them, and all those kind of things, which would have been how we would walk across country and look and say, well, what have we got here? What is available? And that would determine how long you could stay here. But this was definitely a summer camp, which once the eel harvest was over, they would prepare to move further back up into the mountains.
Okay.
To get away from the floods, actually. And there would be different things, of course, growing at the time during there. They knew it would sustain the 100 or so people that eventually came to form Coranderrk.
So when was the official formation of Coranderrk as a mission itself?
Yeah, so 1863.
Right, we're back to
the
that
best
date.
of my knowledge, yeah.
Yep.
So by the time they settled everybody here, so 1861, 1862, they walked into Melbourne. They arranged a meeting with the governor at the time. I don't think we had premiers.
Yeah.
And they asked for this land. They said, look, we're sick of being moved around country. If you give us this land and leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we will look after ourselves.
And this was 50,000 acres, you were telling me.
5,000 acres.
5,000 acres. 50,000 is fair.
If you look through the record books, it's 4,800, it's 5,000, it's 5,200.
It's close enough to 5,000.
I just rounded up to 5,000 acres. Yeah.
All right.
And the decision makers of the day, through legislation, actually gave the land, the 5,000 acres, to the Aboriginals in perpetuity. That was the legislation.
So with that legislation passed, essentially granting it to now it wasn't to the Wurundjeri people, it was to the Aboriginal people, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So there was still no recognition of the Wurundjeri people.
Of the different mobs, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happened then? The growth of Coranderrk.
Good. They've come back.
Yep.
And said, yes, this is our land. Obviously, a government surveyor would have come out and sort of pegged out the areas as to what our limits were, as to where we could live and hopefully survive. And everything was rosy. John Green, still had his church services, but they were outdoor, they were out in the bush. They did all convert here, the ones that hadn't, to Christianity, giving up their multiple wives.
And that includes Barrack and Wonga, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Barrack was also had to give up his witch doctoring, as they called it in those days, because Barrack was well respected as a medicine man.
Yeah.
Although he still managed to practice that, and it's a whole nother conversation about how he seemed to appear in 2 or 3 different places at the one time for treating people. And they did assimilate into the new way of life. And this ground was so good, they did start growing cabbages and corn and potatoes and all the crops that were available at the day.
And you were saying hops before as well, and pretty good hops.
Well, the hops came later. I'm not sure exactly when, but they just cleared a lot of the land, and they had their own cattle. They had pigs and chickens, and they had many, many horses.
Yeah.
Aboriginal people, as we know, throughout all of Australia, became very adept at becoming brilliant horsemen.
Absolutely.
And learning how to shoot, but they were also very good at learning how to use tools. Modern tools and still using their ancient tools. I'm sure the women still would have been using their digging sticks to weed around the cabbages and peas and carrots and things like that because that was their tool.
The adoption of this place, how successful was it in this agriculture, this adopted agriculture?
Well, it was so successful and so well run that they had time to do what we would call activities or hobbies, like we all work for today. They had time to go and celebrate and party down on the water. They had time to still do at the right time of the year some of the traditional harvests of what was still left here on the land. And that sounded like hang on, these people are having fun out here.
Oh, the jealousy rears its ugly head.
So there were people settling around the 5,000 acres.
Yeah.
And apparently quite a few of them got a bit jealous. And they thought, well, if the Aboriginals can work that land and we're struggling on our bits of land, because we understood the soils and we understood the waters, we understood so much more than they did.
Yeah.
I keep going back to it all the time. We are the first scientists of this country, collecting data for tens of thousands of years.
Sure.
Everyone was relying on Joseph Banks' observations in 1770 as about how they could farm. But we understood the seasons. Most of the settlers came out here, were brought over in the ships to arrive here in spring.
Yeah.
So everything looked rosy. They didn't understand that it would dry out or that it would flood or that it would burn and all those kind of things. Whereas we understood all that.
So how many people would have been here on the mission at around about this time?
Well, from everything I've read so far, it sustained sort of a permanent population of around 100,
Right.
Above 100. There were other people that were able to get away from other missions, whether they escaped or were allowed to. As the word about Coranderrk got around and how good it was, many of them wanted to either leave the missions or come in from country and live here at the mission station. So how many people were here over its lifetime from 1863 to 1924? We haven't determined that yet.
Okay.
But definitely the drawings and the plans of the village that we've got shows that quite comfortably with the buildings there was a permanent population of 100 or more at any one time.
And when you're talking about buildings, you were yarning with me earlier about John Green actually supporting a timber mill here.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about that.
So when these places were set up, they were in the standard slab bark mires.
Yep.
Held up with branches that like you see in all the old photos. But he's seen the value of the timber that was around here, and rather than waiting for supplies of timber to come up from Melbourne, he had this idea of building a sawmill, a water-operated sawmill, because the water was flowing, it was all year round, and our people quickly adapted to that and started building timber houses, although still with dirt floors. No remains of them anymore, but there's a whole other story to that. They even got to the stage where they were making their own bricks. That's in the very sort of last days, going up to 1924.
Right.
But the reality is it was looking so successful, and that was not what the government wanted. So there was a concentrated effort. It was how did they actually shut this down, because Coranderrk was actually on the world stage because it was the last bastion of the British colony to say that they were looking after the indigenous peoples, even though it was terra nullius and there were no indigenous peoples.
Exactly.
But they lost the war against slavery. They'd lost all the British colonies. The British colonies in America.
Yep.
India was in
turmoil.
And they needed to hang on to this. And they couldn't do that if Aboriginal people were going to survive. The mission stations
and prosper,
rather than just survive. So there was an organisation which was called the Acclimatisation Society, and that's now known as Zoos Victoria. But the Acclimatisation Society was to actually turn Victoria into England. And they couldn't do that with the Aboriginals in the way. So they underhandedly, they worked out that it was John Green and Barak. So I'm not sure what year this was, but I'm thinking that Wonga had probably died by then.
So at this stage, the Narangita was Barak.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. And they knew that they couldn't do anything if Barak was still in charge. So there was quite a few underhanded things that they did politically. But the most ridiculous one, when I look back on it now, it wouldn't have been ridiculous at the time, was that they got a hold of one settler here who wanted some of this land and asked him to get Barak, because he was such a good shot, to go out and kill a couple of deer, because he was having a feast or whatever.
And these would have been the king's deer.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
So he went out and killed these deer, and then they arrested him for shooting the king's deer, because even here in Australia, deer, salmon and various other animals, just as they are still today in England, all belong to the king, and you have to go through the king's gamekeeper and all that kind of thing.
You think they would have learnt from Robin of Locksley, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Robin Hood.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah. But luckily there was another person who was sympathetic to the Aboriginals, because I should mention that even though there were white settlers moving in around here, there was no education system, but John Green, or actually John Green's wife, ran a schoolhouse here, primarily to teach English and basic reading and writing to the Aboriginal children of the mission, but actually all the white children came here. So the first school in Hillsville was actually at Coranderrk, and the white people used to come here to learn under Mary Green.
Good Lord.
So there was already some acceptance, if you like.
Bit of reconciliation going on there, Unc.
What we're all fighting for today. People ask me about reconciliation. And
let's not go there. Come on.
And to me, it's like, this was the example. Coranderrk was the example how reconciliation could work, and yet they spent so much time then trying to shut the place down.
So how many white people would have been here? Because we know of John Green and his wife.
As living here, that was it, yeah.
Right.
While John Green was here.
Right.
Yeah.
So there weren't guards or enforcers?
No, they were all outside.
Right.
They were all outside the gates. The story that I was told, that if you went outside of the
boundary
markers and you were arrested, you were lucky, because you would just be brought back.
For the unlucky ones, though?
The unlucky ones, if you were caught by a settler or whatever, you could be shot, and no one would ever be charged.
Jeez.
Now, whether that actually happened or not, but we do know that by 1881, that if they did want to walk out of the front gates, they had to carry a passport or a permit, as it did with all the mission stations. But a lot of them were actually used as outworkers on the various stations that were getting set up, because they were actually very industrious. They weren't afraid of hard work.
So let's get back, though, to Barak and taking the king's deer.
Yeah.
Tell us that story.
All right, so this other neighbour knew what was happening, and so stood up in court, and so the charges were dropped. So then they did the next underhanded thing, where they brought up a water cart.
Oh, you told me about this. I love it.
Full of salmon. And they released them into the Coranderrk Creek here and into the Yarra.
What was the goal there?
Well, again, hoping that William Barak or even any Aboriginal person would get caught catching the salmon.
The king salmon, mind you.
Salmon, and they could be arrested and then taken off the mission and potentially transferred to some of the other worse mission stations.
But come on, the kick to the story is, though, Unc.
But the reality is they knew they couldn't do anything unless they got rid of William Barak.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get rid of him.
But what happened to the fish that they brought up?
Oh, they all died. They didn't actually survive in the waters,
I mean, bad for
Of
the
course,
fish.
we know then they introduced the trout, which now are in all Australian rivers, which, they're still available here. But the eels are still here as well, which is the most important part of our lifestyle out of the water. And freshwater mussels aren't here anymore, but anyway, that's another story where...
There's so many other stories we've got to keep track of here. So when these attempts to usurp or bring Barak down didn't work, what was the next step?
Well, they sacked John Green. They thought if they can't get rid of the ringleader, they'll sack John Green and put someone else in charge. Well, actually, they asked him to say, you've got to be more harder on them. Yeah. And he refused to do that, because by then they weren't just his flock, they were his friends. and he was doing everything possible to look after them.
So how long was he with them for? Must have been decades.
Oh, that's well, he was with them at a couple of the previous stations,
Right.
but in 1881 there was an inquiry held, so he would have been sacked before 1881. So we're talking less than 20 years
Right.
that he was in charge here. They brought in a couple of superintendents, but the one that I know the most about is John Strickland, who was actually directed straight from the government, get up there and shut that place down. And he was not a well-liked person. He was apparently quite cruel. He was drunk, or was a drunk. By that time, John Green, after the sawmill, had also introduced as a commercial crop outside of the mission station
Oh, we're back to the
hops,
Great.
growing hops for beer.
Yep.
Because at that time, all the hops were coming still from England on the ships. And apparently hops don't travel very well. And so he started growing hops here, teaching the Aboriginal people how to grow hops, and was actually making money out of the mission station for the mission.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which then allowed apparently the women were very well dressed. They loved it. We did have travelling salesmen coming through here with materials and sewing patterns and things like that, and which the women really loved. Which is, they had the time to do these things instead of waiting on their one dress and one pair of boots and whatever it was that came up from the government.
Well, the question is, though, that if the new superintendent or enforcer was tasked to shut the place down, what then of the permanent
it still had to look
residents here?
like everybody didn't want to be here. So one of the things he did was he brought in white men, or white people I should say, to be a part of the hop harvest, which they were paid for, whereas the Aboriginal people still had to help with the hop harvest.
Yeah.
But for their work, they were only given their supplies of flour, sugar and tobacco.
Sure.
And he had reduced all of that. He was told to save costs. So he was saying, well, we only need X amount of kilos for the thing. But basically they were on starvation rations again, just like they were up in Tauranga country. So again, there was a protest, and Barrack again walked down to Melbourne to protest against the harsh conditions. He asked for John Green to be reinstated. John Green apparently still lived nearby. We did used to sneak off the mission on a Sunday to go and receive his services in the middle of the night. But so when he cut the rations, or wasn't given them enough, unless they actually got into the hop harvest, they would say, well, we're not doing the hop harvest because we're going to starve. So they would go off and hunt kangaroo and fish and all that kind of thing. And he would then take their rations away from them. So basically they had to go back to living the way they were.
Yeah.
But the changes had already happened, and there just wasn't enough around to support them. I get confused when we get to all this part, because it makes me feel a bit ill about what was actually happening. But there were a few people. One was the Argus newspaper, Argus. Yeah. There was a woman called Anne Bonn who played a very important part about the recognition of Aboriginal people, and her and Barrack became very good friends. At one stage, Barrack's son, 10 years old, became sick, and he had to walk him into Melbourne from here. So but we talk about the Barrack walk. Barrack did many walks into Melbourne to protest for his people. Mm-hmm. He couldn't find the hospital, but he knew where Anne Bond's house was, and so he stayed there, took his son into hospital, and unfortunately his son died, and he was never given the body back. It was never returned to him. I'm getting a bit ahead of the story here, but that was kind of what broke Barrack. Arnie Joyce looked at the photos of before and after his son died, and you could see the power and the presence in Barrack. But after his son died, you could see the sadness, which is when he took up his painting to protect our culture as much as he could through his paintings. So to most people, they're brilliant works of art.
But they're more than that.
But to me, they're books.
Yeah.
They're the Bible.
Yeah.
Everyone has a different interpretation of art. I read stories into those paintings just like I read stories into the country. Yeah, like I said, I was getting ahead of myself there.
So let's get back to 1881.
Yeah.
The new.
So look, he did go down and protest.
Yep.
And because of the newspaper and Anne Bonn and all of those people, I don't know what kind of society they were called, but the government actually came out here to Coranderrk and held an inquiry. And there were 41 or 47 submissions from Aboriginal people to whoever ran that inquiry.
Yeah.
And basically, different to today, the media was against the government. And the people won their case to hang on to this land and to manage it for themselves. Barrick's famous words, to me, was, "Give us this country and we will show you that we can work it."
Yeah.
That's all he wanted, was to hang on to that 5,000 acres given to him in 1863 and support his people and protect his culture.
So legislation
they celebrated.
legislation was upheld.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was in the paper, and apparently there was lots of partying here for a couple of days. But then they got back to managing the land. But unfortunately, the powers that be back in governments, we can't accept this. So, which brought around, so how can we get rid of this? So, after that was when Barrick's son got sick. And so Barrick, when he came back from there, was, I guess, depressed. He was full of grief and wasn't actually, I guess, taking on his role that he used to have as Nurrungita. And the reason why I'm here and the rest of my family is because he needed to choose another Nurrungita, and he had no surviving children. And he chose my great-great-grandfather, Robert Wandin, to be the next leader. But before Robert Wandin, I guess, came into maturity and was accepted as Nurrungita, Barrick died in 1903. And after that was when they brought in the Half-Caste Act. It was brought about to try and shut this place down, not just because it was convenient for the whole country, although it was rolled out across the whole country, because there was too much support to say, no, look, the Aboriginal people are looking after themselves. So bringing in the Half-Caste Act and getting all the non-full-bloods, who were all the workers.
Yeah,
All
sure.
that, from teenagers to up to 30 years of age, probably 35 maybe.
But Unc, what would have been the ultimate goal of the government with the inhabitants here? I mean, you're saying you had around about 100 or more Aboriginal people living here in an established settlement.
Although I think over the time there would have been, 700 or 800 people that had came through Coranderrk Station.
So what would have happened to them? We would have had more displaced people. Would they have been, what was the goal, to move them to yet another area?
Well, they did, when they brought in the Half-Caste Act, most of them, they were ordered to go to Lake Tyers. But I feel quite privileged that my particular family line, actually, when the place closed down in 1924, we stayed here in town. We got jobs in the sawmills and we found work.
Right.
And we lived on the outskirts of the boundary.
How many woi-wurrung people Wurundjeri people would have been here at the close of the mission? So 1924.
Look, I don't know how many people. All I do know, what I've been told, that as far as full-bloods go, there was only 22 full-bloods left of Wurundjeri. So it shows how close the government did come to almost exterminating.
So to all those people that don't think genocide occurred in Australia, wake up and smell the roses.
Read the books.
Yeah.
Look at the history. It's there. It happened. People ask me, how come you Aboriginal people are so angry? It happened years ago, a couple of hundred years ago, and it's not. It's not a claim to fame, but my eldest uncle, the last Nurrungita of our family today, he was the last child born here at Coranderrk. It's not, Coranderrk is not in the history. It's one generation ago for me. Yeah. Am I traumatised by it? Well, yeah, I probably am, but I haven't gone to a psychologist to ask. All I know is that from 1924, we still fought to get some of this land back. And in 1998, we did. We got 200 acres back. Again, I'm jumping ahead there, but yeah.
Well, that's okay, because so in 1924, what actually happened then?
It was officially closed down. So they used a couple of other techniques. So they used the Half-Caste Act, which removed all the able-bodied working people off this land.
Right.
So there might have been some very young ones, but mostly they were the older ones who could no longer manage the land. And they looked at it and said, well, you're not managing the land anyway, so we don't need to keep it for you. That didn't work all that well. They then used the excuse that they needed this land for soldier settlement, from the...
World War One, of course.
I think it was actually from the Boer War. It may have been... World War
So
I
it started
as well,
sort of in the very early 1900s.
Yeah, so like 1924 was when it shut down, which was after the First World War.
Yeah.
But they started carving up quite a lot of Coranderrk. And
So
I
this
think
started
that was from
beforehand.
the Boer War.
Gotcha.
Boer War, which was the most recent one to that. It might have been the Crimean War.
Yep.
I can't remember. So it was already whittled down as they moved people off to Lake Tyers. I'm probably getting all my timings wrong here, but the story is still there. It needs a better person than me to pull it together. But we have found out that not one soldier ever got land that was once Coranderrk.
But it was a good excuse to get rid of that problem.
It was the political excuse that they were using
course.
of shutting the place down.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in 1924, it was eventually shut down. And, the next part of that story is that basically the house that was built for John Strickland, which is the one brick building that's left here, which was built by our people, handmade bricks, basically told the rest of the community around, go in and destroy everything. Destroy all evidence of Aboriginal people living here. So the village itself was absolutely razed to the ground. The stables, the dairy, the piggery, the butchery, the gardens, everything was dug up. Everything was removed. And then, by that time, it was all sold off in 1924.
And at that point, we're going to have to leave it. But let me assure you that we are coming back to Uncle Dave in a couple of weeks, because the story of Coranderrk does not finish at 1924.
No, it does
Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here exactly 100 years later.
That's right.
Uncle Dave, until then, thank you so much indeed for trusting us to carry this story out there.
Thanks, Uncle Charles.
For a full transcript of this interview, visit the Victorian Aboriginal News website at vicaboriginalnews.com.au. Until our next episode, stay safe and stay informed.